Welcome to another special edition of COS Live. I'm your host, Rita Peters. I'm the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs with Convention of States Action. And we're bringing you this special edition this morning because in just a few moments, we are expecting a hearing of the Kansas House Committee on Federal and State Affairs in consideration of our Article 5 Convention of States legislation, which is titled in this legislature as H.C.R. 5008. Now, Convention of States co-founder and senior advisor Michael Farris is standing by to testify remotely. 19 states have already passed our resolution calling for an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution on three topics: fiscal restraints, term limits, and limits on the federal scope and jurisdiction. We need 34 states to get to convention, so just 15 to go to call the first ever Article 5 Convention of States. Currently, there are 18 additional states that have introduced our resolution this year, with more expected to come. All of these now have active legislation based on our model language, limited to these three subject matters that I mentioned earlier. So, how did we get to this point in Kansas? Well, the Convention of States Kansas volunteer team has been busy building support across the state and in the legislature. Over 42,000 Kansans have signed the Convention of States petition asking their state legislators to vote yes for Convention of States. And I want to remind you to stay tuned after the vote because we will have a recap, a summary, and analysis and on the ground reaction to whatever it is that's about to transpire in Kansas this morning. Now, in 2023 legislative news for Convention of States, so far, 4 states have passed the COS resolution through a legislative committee. Of course, that's the first hurdle after being introduced in a legislature, is for a resolution to get through a committee. So the states where we've passed committees so far this year are Montana, New Hampshire, Virginia, and Wyoming. And in Wyoming, we were able to achieve a chamber victory, meaning our resolution passed in the full Senate of Wyoming. It is now pending in the Wyoming House, and we are all, of course, eagerly awaiting news of the next step there, which would be a committee hearing. We were just yesterday assigned to the Wyoming House Revenue Committee, so we're just waiting for news on when that committee will have a hearing, just like the Kansas House Committee is about to do this morning. So I mentioned that 19 states have already passed our COS resolution. I believe Producer G has a graphic to show you those 19 states. There it is. The ones in green, those are Georgia, Alaska, Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Tennessee, North Dakota, Arizona, Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Utah, Nebraska, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and South Carolina. I also mentioned a few minutes ago that we need 34 states in order to call the first ever Article 5 convention. And right now, an additional 18 states are considering our Article 5 application for the year. Those are Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, New Hampshire, New Mexico, New York, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming. All of those states have introduced our Article 5 application so far this year. And I want to mention too that a recent poll from the Trafalgar Group revealed that a supermajority of voters across the country support a convention of states on term limits, fiscal restraints, and limits on federal power. So note that this includes a majority of Democrat voters. This is truly a nonpartisan movement of the people to restore a proper balance of power between the federal government and the states, to impose fiscal sanity, fiscal restraints on Washington, D.C. Every American knows that that is essential for the future prospering of America. We have to impose fiscal restraints on Washington from the outside in. Producer G is helpfully showing us a graphic that shows our Convention of States application. So in the states that introduce our application, their resolution reads like this. The legislature of the state of, here we're going to be watching Kansas. So Kansas applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of a convention of states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That's number 2. And limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So we talked about fiscal restraints. Limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That would allow the states to address things like the federal government being involved in the state's education system. Well, we know that nothing in the Constitution actually gives the federal government power over the education systems in the states. So, this topic in our resolution allows the states to address federal overreaches like that through a properly phrased amendment that fits within the scope of this application. And then finally, term limits. The vast majority of the American people agree that we need to put term limits on career politicians in Washington, D.C. We need to let new people get in there, people who have not lost touch with their constituents, with the vast majority of Americans by spending so much time in Washington, D.C. In short, we need to drain the swamp, and that's what this is all about. So we're just waiting here. The Kansas House Committee should be going live any second now. As I mentioned, we have none other than Michael Farris, co-founder of Convention of States, who has now returned to the organization after spending a time working for Alliance Defending Freedom as their president and CEO. He has now returned to Convention of States action as a senior advisor because he is so convinced of the importance of what we're doing at Convention of States in order to restore the Republic. So he's standing by remotely to offer testimony. We're all excited to hear what he's going to have to say. I'm expecting we will hear from our grassroots volunteers in Kansas who are probably already there in the committee hearing room, waiting to speak to the committee members and explain to them why it's so important to them to act. Article 5 of the Constitution gives the state legislatures this power to impose this really powerful check on an out of control, runaway federal government in Washington, D.C. But we need the people, the grassroots of America, to show up, stand up, and speak up to make sure that their state legislators know that we want them to use this power. The founders gave it to them for a reason, so that they can use it in exactly a situation like we have today, where Congress is overstepping its bounds. It's not going to restrain itself. It's time for the states to act. And that's what this movement is all about. So I think we're going to go ahead and go live now. Producer G, doesn't look like we have anything happening. What I expect to happen again is that we will hear from grassroots volunteers. We'll hear our sponsor introduce the resolution and tell the committee members a little bit about what it's all about. We'll probably hear them talk about those three topics that frame the application for a convention to propose amendments, because just to be clear, this is not a wide open convention where state delegations are going to go and just talk about whatever amendments they want. They're going to go to convention and be limited to discussing amendment proposals on the three topics. And once again, those three topics are imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and thirdly, setting term limits on federal officials and members of Congress. So let's just, I think Producer G has a graphic that sets up and shows us the legislative process. So for those of you, excuse me, who are new to this graphic sort of explains how the process works. First, the people lead. That's we, the people. The citizens ask state legislators to sponsor and support the Convention of States resolution that we've been talking about, that we're going to hear debated in Kansas this morning. Then, secondly, the state legislators act. So, a state legislator listens to the people and sponsors the Convention of States resolution by introducing it or filing it in his or her state legislature. The Convention of States resolution has to go through committee. That's where we are in Kansas this morning. That's the process you're about to watch live as the committee considers and takes testimony on and debates the resolution. And then if the committee recommends passage, that resolution goes to the floor of each chamber. That means it goes to the full body. It would go to the full House of Representatives in Kansas. And if it passes in the House, then it crosses over to the Senate, where it goes through a very similar process on that side. So those are the steps of this process. Okay, so once the state passes the resolution in its House and its Senate, then we have to get to 34 states. So it's the legislatures of 34 states that need to do that in order for the convention to be called. Now, notice you didn't hear me talk about the governor. That's because the governor of the state is actually not involved in this process at all. Article 5 of the Constitution gives this authority to the state legislature alone. There's no role for the governor. So once 34 state legislatures pass the resolution, the state legislatures then choose delegates to represent them and act as their agents at the convention. And the states can send as many delegates as they want, but each state only gets one vote at the convention. At the convention, amendments get proposed. Delegates propose, debate on, discuss, and then vote on amendment proposals that fit within the topic of the resolution, which I've already discussed. And Producer G, I think we have movement here, so we'll go live now to the Kansas House Committee.
Hey,
again,
folks,
stay tuned afterwards for commentary.
Thank you. Good morning, committee. There's enough folks here to get started, and it'll be a little bit before we start on the working the HCR. So we'll do a little bit of cleanup. Dennis, who's on WebEx?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We have no committee members on WebEx at this moment.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that. And then I have in bold print here, approve the minutes. They're like 3-inch letters because I've forgotten to ask that for the last couple of meetings. So approve the minutes of 124, 125, and 131 of 23. Motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that we approve the minutes of January 24th, 25th, and 31st of 2023.
I have a motion, second by Representative Mosier. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Okay, bill introductions. Committee. Welcome to committee. Dennis? Is that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doug Jorgensen, State Farm Marshal, and I'd like to introduce a bill to change and update one of our boiler inspection statutes. The RS number is 23 RS 1085.
Very good. Thank you for that. Committee, any objections? Seeing none, bill is introduced.
Thank you.
Further bill introductions. Seeing none, we're going to move on to the hearing on HCR 5008, applying for to Congress for a call of the Convention of States for limited purposes, amending the Constitution of the United States to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Our first proponent is on WebEx. Oh, I do that every time. I'll get it one of these years. Thank you, Mike. Can you explain this? I think everybody in this room already knows what it's about a half a dozen times over.
Mike Heim with the Revisor Statutes Office. This is a concurrent resolution. You had one similar to this a week or so ago dealing with term limits. And I've got a little summary of what this does. But if you look on page 1 there, it calls it a convention to impose limit or amendments to the Constitution to impose fiscal restraints, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit terms of office for officials of the federal government and members of Congress. So it's fairly expansive.
Very good. Committee questions of the revisor. Representative Miller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mike, is there anything preventing this convention from expanding past what we are calling the convention for?
Representative, I'm not sure that's a question for the revisor.
Is it not? Who would that be for?
So
I'm sorry.
We'll get into that when we work the bill, and you can ask that question. But I think he's just explained the bill. So very good. Committee, further questions of the revisor? Mike, thank you very much. Okay, the first item of business, I have Michael Ferris, Convention of States Action, and Michael is with us on WebEx. Michael, are you there?
I've been unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the honor of being able to be here by WebEx. I wish I could be there in person. I am an attorney, been in practice since 1976. In areas of Article 5 background, I represented 4 Washington state legislators in the late 70s on into the early 80s in a case involving the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment when Congress tried to change the rules for the deadline for ratification, expanding the deadline from 7 years to approximately 10 and a half years. I was in that case all the way to the Supreme Court. And so I'm one of the few lawyers who have actually litigated in the Article 5 area. I've also written an article concerning the whole issue of whether or not the original Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 was a runaway. And that article is published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. It's called Defying Convention Wisdom. And I'll talk about the substance of that real briefly in just a minute. The reason that Article 5 was written the way it is because of a suggestion that George Mason made in the last week of the Constitutional Convention. Up until that time, the proposed Constitution had only one method of proposing amendments. Congress had to propose all amendments, the states had to ratify all amendments. But Mason stood up and said, in effect, there's going to be a day when Congress abuses its power. When the federal government abuses its power, we can never expect Congress to propose amendments limiting its own power. We need to give the ability to limit the power of the federal government through proposed amendments. And the minutes of the Constitutional Convention say that his recommendation was agreed to nem com, which means without debate. And so it was unanimously agreed to by the founders. The founders gave states the authority to rein in abuse of power by the federal government. And with the authority that comes to you directly from Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, I contend that the state legislators have the moral responsibility to do so. My wife and I have 10 children. I know it's an astonishing revelation, but it's true. So I've raised a lot of kids. If you had a child grow up for a long time and never discipline them, it would not be a very pretty picture. And the same thing is true of what we're dealing with here. Congress and the federal government have been expanding and abusing their power for decades upon decades, and the states have never used their authority under Article 5 to rein them in. For example, in December of this last year, there was a package of legislation, $1.7 trillion in spending, thousands of pages, hundreds of both spending and non-spending measures jammed together in one bill. If there was a single subject rule in the federal Constitution, like there is in 41 states, they couldn't do this. And this massive abuse of spending power and regulatory power would not be possible. If they had to break that all up, first of all, you couldn't get floor time for all that conglomeration. And secondly, a number of those things would never pass. So one of the procedural changes that could be made and would be germane under the application that we've proposed would be a single subject rule. And I think it would have a great deal of cleaning up the federal government's legislative process. I would be glad to answer the question that was posed to the code revisor about changing the subject. There have been hundreds and hundreds of Article 5 applications over the years. More than 34 states have existing valid applications, but they're not on the same subject. And the reason that we've never had a convention is they have to be on the same subject. You can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. That's what the Article 5 litigation that I was involved with the ERA said. You can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. When there's a call for a convention for a particular purpose, it's limited to that purpose. There's another historical example. The Articles of Confederation were tried. There was an effort to change them twice. First was the Annapolis Convention, where they were limited only to the subject of commerce. The delegates got together and said, commerce isn't a big enough area of discussion for us. We need to have authority to talk about more topics. And so they said, we've got to go back to our states and get a new resolution urging that we have a broader mandate to talk about things. They didn't run away. They went back and got a different authority. And the new authority said that they were to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. And so that's the background, and there's no way that this can be violated. And if there is, I guarantee you, I will file the lawsuit myself, just like I did with the ERA. I was the first one to file the lawsuit challenging that misuse of the rules of the Article 5 process. We were successful then, and I'm confident we would be successful now. With that background, I'd be glad to answer any questions that the committee might have. I was the draftsman of the operative language of the text in front of you, and it's been passed verbatim in that form in 19 states, and we're hoping that your fine state of Kansas will be the 20th state.
Very good, Michael. Thank you for that. Committee questions of Michael. Seeing none, thank you for being here. Oh, sorry. Representative Hauser.
Hit the button. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ferris. I got a question for you. Can you guys, who controls the purse strings of the federal government?
Well, it's the House of Representatives. All revenue measures must begin in the House of Representatives. Then ultimately the Senate and the President get involved because all three branches have to be involved, or, a bill has to pass both branches and be signed by the President. But so in a broad sense, in a legislative sense, it's the entire congressional process.
Could you show some kind of, I want to say, proof of well, let me just ask you this question. How actively do you guys, the Convention of States movement, petition our congressmen to actually balance the budget because they control the purse strings? Can you say that? Can you show me anything that says that you try to get your followers to petition the Congress to control their spending and go that route instead of just trying to open up the Constitution again?
Well, first of all, the premise of your question isn't accurate. We aren't opening up the Constitution by proposing amendments any more than Congress is opening up the Constitution when it proposes discrete amendments. If you will, Congress has the authority to propose amendments every single day. So if the Constitution's open in that sense, it's open every day when Congress is in session. But millions and millions of Americans have urged Congress to balance the budget. President Reagan ran urging a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. He thought that amendment was necessary in order to put discipline on Congress, and Congress simply has never done so. So have we done that? No, because it would be an exercise in frustration, because millions of Americans have been doing this for decades upon decades, and it's time to bring some restraint upon them that's structural in nature, because even if they balance the budget 1 year, that doesn't mean they'll balance it the following year. Until there's structural changes, it's not going to happen on a consistent basis.
Well, I'm just going to end with a comment. Madison Road and Farrell is 58, and I'll go down just a summation of his deal. And he, quote, "This power over the purse may, in fact, be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure." So I would argue that we should start there, mass grassroots campaign against our congressmen saying, hey, cut this junk out or we're going to get rid of you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Proponents or conferees, I might remind you to be respectful of the committee's time and kind of get to the point. So anyway, next I have Ben Terrell. Ben, thank you for being here. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Ben Terrell, and I'm a resident of Shawnee, Kansas. I'm a retired business research and human resources professional. 2023 marks the beginning of my 8th year as a volunteer and my 5th year serving as the legislative liaison for Convention of States Action here in Kansas. I represent over 40,000 petitioners within this state and dozens of other volunteers like myself. Thank you for hearing our testimony on this resolution today. And I'm here to answer this question. Why did we request it? And why are we taking your time? It's because we have all come to the distressing conclusion that selecting the best representatives and voting them into office at the federal level no longer secures our rights in the Constitution from the federal government itself. We find the government in Washington has, in fact, become an enemy of our liberty, and the vested interest there do not and will not permit its correction. Therefore, that you have this power has never been denied. We have found this to our great surprise and delight, that the framers of our Constitution, as Mr. Ferris just reminded us, have provided a way for us to check the powers of the federal government. The way to restore constitutional order is through you, our Kansas legislators, named as officers in the Constitution in the 5th article of this document, to be able to propose amendments without the consent of Congress, the President, or the Supreme Court, when 2/3 of the states call for a convention to meet and deliberate on amendments on the same subject. That you have this power, again, has never been denied. It is written in the plain language of Article 5 of the Constitution. I'm sure you have all read it. I'm holding up the paragraph here in case you would like to see that it's a very short paragraph. Kansas itself is no stranger to this process, having made 8 calls for such conventions between 1907 and 1978. 2 of those calls are still active. One from 1951 that has to do with changes to the federal taxing authority, and another from 1978 calling for a balanced budget amendment. Our own proposal has been brought to this committee several times, beginning in 2015. It has passed favorably out of this committee each time except once in 2017, and it has been voted on the floor of the House twice, once in 2016 and again last year in 2022. Each time, it received over 60% of all possible votes. I have those tallies if you would like them. The reason we are here today is we're asking you yet again to exercise your authority because our government is designed for the ambitions of one part to be checked by another part. Our system of shared sovereignty is called federalism. Since you have the authority and if you see the problems as we do, or at least even partly so, then you have a moral responsibility to exercise your authority. Just as you would expect to see an officer of the law who witnessed a theft or committed an assault to do something to restore property or peace, you also are right to expect action of yourselves in this matter. Now, some will argue that this particular part of the Constitution must not be used. That's a strange argument to me for someone who calls themselves a constitutionalist. It's too full of unknown dangers, they will say, and other federal officers should just live up to their oaths of office. Well, I say, what about the known dangers of continuing to live as we do under a federal government that is daily breaking the Constitution? And what of your oaths, ladies and gentlemen, as officers of this Constitution to support and defend it? In reality, people often require incentives to do what is right and disincentives to refrain from doing what is wrong or harmful. We may wish all we wish that all people were angels and would behave as such, but it will never be. As James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed. Then in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And so we ask you to use your authority, in Madison's words, to oblige the federal government to control itself by supporting and voting for HCR 5008. I will stand for questions or sit down and you can ask them later as you wish.
Very good. We'll do questions now. Committee questions. Representative Saunders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you in touch with the grassroots a lot? I know you know what's going on with the legislators, and I dare say you probably have a pretty good idea of how all 125 of us will vote on this issue. But what I want to know about the grassroots people, what kind of feedback do you get at that level?
The people are angry and scared. The people have been harmed by federal government abuse. And just recently, many of them have had to give up their livelihoods and their businesses because of mandates that extended through the COVID lockdown and affected their children, affected their businesses or their homes. People have seen this going on for many years without relief. My own story is that I got involved shortly after our healthcare in this country was nationalized in 2010. And I've been active in politics since then. And I hear the same form of activism, of desire for change, of using the authority that we have as citizens of the United States before it's too late. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Thomas. Representative Smith.
I think we just need to switch names. What do you think, Representative?
I apologize.
No, no problem. It happened in caucus this morning too. So, Mr. Terrell, thank you for your testimony. When I first learned of Convention of States years ago, one of my questions was who represents the state? What are the delegates and what is the process there? Because the Constitution is silent on that. Now, I know it's important to have all these applications be similar when they're passed in each state. Has your organization, has anybody made an effort to ever say, the Speaker of the House, actually put that in the application and define who the delegates are so there's a little bit more certainty?
Thank you for the question, Representative Smith. The reason the Constitution is silent is because at the time it was written, everybody understood what the rules were. A similar example would be everyone is guaranteed to a trial by jury, and the specifics of a trial by jury are also not spelled out, as you may know, in the Constitution. As to delegate selection and the process, I'm going to let the second speaker, Mr. John Stepnoski, one of our other volunteers, go into more detail on that. But I will tell you the basics. The basics are, yes, we'd be happy to see the legislature take up a bill. In fact, there is one active in the Senate right now, SB 92, in the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee, to work out the details of how Kansas would select its delegates to a convention and hold them accountable and communicate with them, and how many would there be and how would they vote. Those are all pertinent questions that you all ultimately have control over.
So just to follow up, since it's also silent, does each state get one vote?
Yes.
At the convention? Okay.
Yes, it is a convention of states, not of something else. Yeah.
So if Kansas decided to send 2 delegates and California said they wanted to send 20, they don't have 20 votes. Each state gets 1 vote.
Yes, sir. That is correct.
Thank you.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Next, we have John. I'm not going to even try to butcher your name. So, John, thank you for being in committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Stepnoski, John Stepnoski is my name. I'm a volunteer with Convention of States. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you today in support of HCR 5008. I am a volunteer with Convention of States. I'm not a paid person. I'm just a guy who thinks about my kids and my grandkids. I just want to give you a little bit of background about me. I was a businessman. My grandparents came from Poland and from Italy. They came to the United States with a dream that they couldn't fulfill in their home countries. They came through Ellis Island. I've actually seen some of the documents. So to me, this is a very, very personal thing. And as I was growing up, they instilled in me the values of hard work. And if you work hard in this country, you're going to be able to succeed. And I've had that opportunity. And yet, as I look at my children and my grandchildren, they don't have the same opportunities that I had. The federal government, through its overreach, has taken away many of the individual liberties that we as a country were founded on. And I'd just like to say that in the Declaration of Independence, it says we all have the right for the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and equality that our Creator has given us. So I want to speak specifically on the process today, because there's a lot of questions about the process. There's been over 40 Convention of the States throughout our history, none of them at the national level, 20 before the Constitution was actually ratified, and 22 since that time. And in each one of these conventions, there's been rules set forth. Much like Congress, when they proposed amendments, they had to go through rules, and the House had to have their rules and had to have a resolution. The Senate had to have their rules, and they had to have a resolution. Those resolutions had to be the same. And in each case, 2/3 of that governing body had to approve the resolutions. And then it became a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So I guess you could say there's been lots of conventions of states in the past, because there are 27 amendments to our U.S. Constitution. And many of those amendments to the U.S. Constitution were based on initiation from the states. If you look back at the change from senators being appointed by the states, over 22 states proposed Convention of State resolutions prior to that actually happening, before Congress did propose that and the states ratified that. There are other examples that I could give you if you'd like them. As I said, there has been 42 conventions that I'm aware of over the past 250 plus years in the United States. As a matter of fact, as an attachment to the document that I gave you today, I gave you an example of a simulated Convention of the States convention that was actually carried out in 2016. Representatives from all 50 states were part of that convention, and they actually talked about the 3 issues that are in the resolution in front of you today. Obviously, it was a non-binding. It was an exercise, but it was an example of how this could happen and how we could do this. Also, as late as in 2017, there was a convention in Arizona called the Arizona Balanced Budget Amendment Planning Convention, where actually 22 states got together and talked specifically about how they would have a convention of states based on a balanced budget amendment. At that time, it was very close to 34 states actually having resolutions on that issue. So I'm here today to say that I don't believe there is a real concern about a runaway convention. There are so many guide rails to the convention process. First of all, you can only talk about the subjects. Second of all, the delegates have to agree on them. Third of all, if they don't agree, nothing happens. Fourth of all, once the delegates of the convention or the commissioners actually propose amendments, that's all they are, is proposed. They have to go out to the 50 states. And 38 state legislatures have to pass those resolutions or those proposed amendments. It's been done 27 times in our history, and I believe it's time that the states use their authority to help regulate the overreach of what we see in our federal government today. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Committee questions. Representative Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Stepnowski. You made a statement that your children have less liberties than you have. Can you cite examples?
Well, nobody ever told me I had to have a vaccination when I went to school. But today, my children and grandchildren were required that. When I was growing up, the federal government actually proposed budgets, and they actually tried to live by their budgets. We haven't had a budget at the federal level that has been proposed and actually.
Mr. Stepnowski, I asked you about your children, the liberties, and you cited. Can you give me more examples of that?
The regulatory climate that my children have as it relates to one of my sons is in the trucking business. Because of all the regulations, he lived in Illinois, he just moved recently. Because of the trucking regulations as an independent business owner, he was run out of business because he could no longer afford the regulatory issues that were upon him as far as taxes, as far as requirements that he had as a businessman, as a trucker. So he moved to Missouri and had to start a new business. That would be one example.
So he did have that liberty to move.
He had the liberty to move, but he didn't have the liberty to continue that job.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rees. Representative Rees. Other questions?
Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I think you said that there were 20 conventions called before the Constitution was ratified.
That is correct, to the best of my knowledge.
And how many of those were Article 5 conventions?
I don't believe any of them were Article 5 conventions.
And there were 22 after the Constitution was ratified?
That is correct.
And how many of those were Article 5 conventions?
They were interstate conventions, never Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you.
Representative Saunders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So 27 amendments, they've all been approved by the state legislatures. Have we ever had an amendment that has gotten into the Constitution without that approval process?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, further questions? Representative Hauser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Stepnowski, for being here today in your testimony. You mentioned rules earlier, and how we'll have these conventions will have rules. You're aware that the House and the Senate and have rules here to how we conduct our business, and we have joint rules between the House and the Senate. I can guarantee you there's not one year that we do not vote to override, overturn, or just ignore some rules in this body. Which goes to my point is you can do anything you want if you have enough votes to do anything in a parliamentary procedure. So as is proved here every year, for a perfect example, we've got ones that you can't work past midnight. Every year we break it, every year. And I'm just saying, comment-wise, that this could happen just as well in the Convention of States. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, further questions?
Could I respond to that, Mr. Chair?
You may.
Yeah, Representative Hauser, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. But remember, this is a meeting convening to discuss amendments to the U.S. Constitution based on the subject matter. They could come out with an amendment, a requested amendment that is different than what the meeting initially indicated. But remember, 38 states have to ratify that, 3/4. And I can not guarantee, but I believe that if the convention proposed an amendment that was outside the scope of the original part of the mandate, that 13 states would say no, because we're all going there for the same reason. And I think that's one of the great safeguards that we have. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have David Copeland. David, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm a retired professional engineer. I live in Overland Park and a volunteer with Convention of States. I think this is I think Ben and I have about the same tenure as volunteers for this organization. But I'm here also to represent the grassroots. There are over 42,000 petitions that have come from the grassroots to you and the members of your bodies. As Ben said, 7 years ago, a lot of people were signing the petition because they were concerned about the change to our federal medical system and what was going to happen, or the creation of a federal medical system, and they could see more coming. And so now we find ourselves that there's been a lot come since then. Since Obamacare, we've had quite a number of things. The people used to say they were most concerned not about a loss of their rights, but they were concerned about the budget. You know, we used to have a $10 trillion national debt. It's 31.5 trillion, and it's growing at $1 trillion a year. And there appears to be no mechanism, there's no structural mechanism in our federal system to allow that to stop. It's automatically increased. So as Mr. Ferris testified, this is not going to be a year-to-year, budget-to-budget fix. There needs to be a structural change. And people sign the petition because they say there's no other way to do it. We must have structural change to address the debt. The other thing is term limits. And I can tell you, we'll work events and people will walk by and they'll look up Convention of States. What's that about? And all you have to do is mention, are you interested in term limits for Congress? And they don't need to hear anything else. They're ready to sign. So, well, hold on, let me tell you the rest of it. That's all right. That's enough. It was great to see U.S. term limits in here last week and to see that you guys have passed that on to the House for action, because that is one of the great concerns. People see they can vote and things don't change in D.C. It doesn't matter who they send, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. The process continues and there seems to be no impact. So it's not going to be a political solution. People in this country recognize it's going to take a structural solution. And you can just almost every year you see someone in the Senate or the House introduce a term limit bill in Washington. But that's politics. They know it's not going to be acted on. So let's be real about this. The only way we're ever going to have term limits is through this process. In the last couple of years, term limits and the balanced budget have kind of taken a back seat because now people are afraid. And this was in response, I think, both Ben and John mentioned. People are afraid. What is the federal government going to do next? And how do we stop it? Where are the brakes? The brakes are not in going into the ballot, into the voting booth. Those brakes aren't there. Show me the brakes in that. From one party to the other, the abuse and the growth of federal power and the loss of individual liberty continues. The only brakes we're ever going to see are in Article 5. it was great to have co-founder Mike Ferris testify. Yeah, he took a lot of my testimony out. I was going to explain the Runaway Convention. One thing I will say, last week in this chamber, an opponent to this process mentioned that the Philadelphia Convention self-ratified. Well, no, there are. If you have one of these pocket constitutions, the first 17 pages are the 7 articles of our Constitution. Page 18 and 19 is the resolution that was sent by the convention to the Confederation Congress, as well as the state legislatures of the 13 states, recommending a change of the ratification process of the Articles of Confederation. And both the Congress and the 13 states acted on that resolution and changed the ratification process to allow ratification by 9 states. The ratification for changes to the Articles of Confederation. So when all 13 states agreed to that change. So the Constitution was not self-ratified by the convention. When the convention ended, nothing had changed. They were still under the Articles of Confederation. That was on September 17th, 1787. Our Constitution didn't come into effect until June 21st, 1788, when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. I can talk about the opponents and what they will claim. They'll talk about a constitutional convention. This isn't a constitutional convention. Article 5 calls it a convention for proposing amendments. Let's call it what the framers called it. Rather than talk about the opposition, I'd like to talk about the opportunities. And the opportunities that I see is Americans can have faith in their government again, because right now they have none. We know what you guys do here year after year. You keep the lights on in this state. You keep the state troopers out there. You keep the teachers in the schools. There's so much that you do that, quite frankly, most Kansans take for granted. You know for a fact, if you walk through your district, most people in your district don't know who you are. If they ask, who's your state representative, they're going to say, well, that's Sharice Davids. You know that. So, what you do here is so important. And that's why the framers gave you the authority to break the glass and put the fire out. So, on behalf of those 42,000 Kansans who don't even know who you are, step up, do this, not just for them, for their families, and for the rest of the country for which you serve a very important role. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good, David. Thank you for that. Committee questions. Representative Garber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. Do you, in your opinion, is the federal government following the Constitution now?
I believe there are areas of the Constitution that have been stretched beyond the original intent. But for the most part, the Constitution is followed. We have a Supreme Court that answers that question every day they're in session when people feel like their constitutional rights have been violated, and that's where it ends up. We have the opportunity to rein or bring these areas of conflict, these areas that have been stretched out, we can bring them back towards their original intent. The areas of regulation that have been justified by the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was originally intended to regulate interstate shipment. Regulate interstate shipments. Well, just about every commercial regulation that we have is flowing out of that exaggeration or this expansion of the Commerce Clause. So I would say most people believe that they're not breaking the law, they're not violating the Constitution. And we have in order to make this whole process work, there's going to have to be an education process of why there needs to be a redefinition of the Commerce Clause in order to carve that regulation back out or out.
If I may, Chairman.
Yes, you may.
I understand what you're saying. I should have asked, do you believe that they're following the intent of the original signers of our Constitution?
And no, sir, I do not believe that.
Thank you. So,
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, David, thank you for being here. I might add, Comfreys, keep your comments to a minimum. We've got a time constraint, so I want to bring thank you for being here. I'll bring your attention to the written proponents here. They're listed here on Gary Burnett and Angel Cushing, Tom Harmon, Viola Haskett, Tim Johnson, Charles Myers, Carl Nelson, Barbara Norman, John and Kim Stauffer, and Bob Straughter. So next we'll have opponents. And with that, I have John Axtell. John, welcome to committee.
Good morning. I'm John Axtell, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for Kansas Campaign for Liberty. Honorable Chairman Carpenter and members of the House Federal and State Affairs Committee, I oppose HCR 5008 for several reasons. I'd first like to talk about the Runaway Convention. And in last week's discussion, we went into depth about the fact that every one of the delegates, or virtually all of the delegates to the convention, agreed on one thing, and that was that they had exceeded their authority under the orders or charters that they were given by the Congress and by the states. There were two viewpoints among the delegates. One was they exceeded their authority and they should stop. And the other was that they exceeded their authority and they should bravely proceed. And one example from William Patterson, a New Jersey delegate who wanted to stop, was that he said, "We ought to keep within its limits, or we should be charged by our constituents with usurpation. Let us return to our states and obtain larger powers, not assume them ourselves," end quote. So you see, it's very clear that they knew that they were exceeding their authority. And what's even more clear is when Madison, in Federalist 40, admits to doing so. And I'll give the full text because it's important. He said, quote, in one particular, it is admitted that the convention have departed from the tenor of their commission. Instead of reporting a plan requiring the confirmation of all the states, they have reported a plan which is to be confirmed and may be carried into effect by 9 states only. Now, I don't have to argue with the proponents about this point because James Madison does that for me. He makes it very clear that they exceeded their authority. That's not my responsibility to carry that argument. So, in changing the requirement for ratification within the convention itself, they actually provided an amendment, and not only provided it, but ratified it and established that amendment within the Constitution. That is a gross usurpation of the authority, more than what was even discussed in many conversations. So the question is not, was that a runaway convention or not? It was. But the question is, will a future convention called under Article 5 also be runaway? And to answer that question, we must look at the authority to which delegates appealed for their ability to exceed the authority that they were delegated by the states and the Congress. And that authority is in we the people. And the delegates cited first principles and the Declaration of Independence. And with this authority, the delegates knew that they could do as they pleased. And Madison says very clearly that, quote, the people were, in fact, the fountain of all power. And by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased, end quote. With the authority of the people, the delegates felt that they could alter constitutions as they pleased. Now, I give case history from state constitutional conventions as well in my written testimony. I won't give the details of that, but in that case history, it also cites this same basic principle being invoked by delegates to state conventions who also decide to go beyond their delegated authority. And what do they cite? They cite we the people and the fundamental principles as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So this could be, and likely will be, and has all the authority to be a runaway convention. Okay, let's depart from the idea of the runaway convention, though, and let's address this particular resolution and what it proposes. And you can see that the proposed solutions do not solve the problem. We've talked about fiscal restraints, and one fiscal restraint that's being considered, I'm sure, is a balanced budget amendment, but we also know that a balanced budget requirement doesn't really do the job that we want it to do, because right here in the state of Kansas, a balanced budget requirement resulted in the passage of the largest tax hike in the history of the state of Kansas in order to meet that requirement. We've talked about term limits. James Madison opposed term limits. That is very clearly stated in his letter, The Federalist 53. But what puzzles me about term limits is this. While proponents tell us that we cannot hold elected officials accountable, for some reason, they believe that we can hold appointed convention delegates accountable. But logically, those appointed delegates are one step further from the accountability of the election process than their elected officials. Therefore, it's not even logical to state those two things in the same conversation. You cannot hold one and the other at the same time as beliefs, logically. You must surrender one or the other. You can't have it both ways. I also oppose this resolution because a constitutional convention, even if it's orderly, would not produce the desired results, because when you have 49 states that have imposed lockdowns, 46 states that have passed Common Core, 38 plus states that have passed Obamacare expansion, where are the 38 states that will side with us on good bills, good resolutions, good amendments, whatever? And where are the 13 states that will side with us in blocking the bad ones? Now, finally, there is a plan in place. We've heard about it, and we know about it, to sue the Kansas Constitution, sue against the Kansas Constitution in federal court. But this whole process just proves to show that the process of calling this whole idea and scheme of doing this calls into question the idea that a convention, quote, cannot be constrained by the people of Kansas. It's proof that it cannot be constrained by the people of Kansas. Let's revisit a couple of points. We, the people of Kansas, created the Kansas Constitution. The Kansas Constitution provides for the Kansas legislature. Therefore, properly stated, the Kansas legislature works for we, the people of Kansas, under the Kansas Constitution. And to take this issue or question into federal court is to take the whole issue and question out of that context of what's supposed to happen in the state of Kansas, and it puts it into that very same system of federal courts, which the proponents have complained bitterly, and I agree on these complaints, is out of control, is overreaching, and so on. The proper adjudication of this question of what is the appropriate measure by which this should be considered passed, the proper adjudication of that is to sit down, grab a copy of the Kansas Constitution, look at Article 2, Section 13, read it, see what it says, and abide by that in every sense, and do not do anything to subvert that, because you have sworn an oath under God, to support the Kansas Constitution, and that means do not do anything to subvert it. That's the proper adjudication. But instead, proponents want to throw this issue, this question, into federal courts. They want to throw it into federal courts where they can, as the federal cases have said in this letter that we've all, I think, probably heard about, and those federal cases exist whether we acknowledge the letter or not, okay? They say that the Kansas legislature can act as if they were not servants of we the people of Kansas. They can act as if they're not under the Kansas Constitution. Well, what would you expect of the federal courts? These are the same federal courts that have said that this process, quote, cannot be constrained by the people of Kansas. These are the same federal courts that have taken every opportunity to stomp on the liberties of we the people and to subvert the rights and the sovereignty of the state of Kansas. These are the same federal courts that have done exactly that. What would you expect of them? They're going to take all the power that they can and put it in the hands of the federal government with virtually every decision that they make. We, the people of Kansas, deserve better. I would urge you strongly to vote against HCR 5008. I thank you for your time, and I will stand for questions.
Very good. Committee questions. I'm going to get it right this time. Representative Thomas.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Smith.
Yeah. Sorry, inside joke, apparently. I see Representative Thomas isn't even here now. So. Thank you for your testimony. I think we've got a bit of a disagreement here, so I want to clarify the ratification process and what you believe could potentially happen. And with your leave, Mr. Chairman, I want to propose a hypothetical situation where we approve, let's say we have the majority, the number required of states to approve a convention of states to call for the application for reducing the required number to ratify from 3/4 to a simple majority. Let's say we have enough states that submit that application. The convention of states is called. They follow all the rules. They adopt that proposal to propose that amendment to the United States Constitution that a simple majority is all that is needed to ratify instead of 3/4. At the result of that convention, are you saying that if they can self-ratify, that wouldn't have to come back to the states operating under the U.S. Constitution now for ratification? If the convention approved that amendment, does that become part of law? Does that become part of the Constitution immediately without ratification?
So are you asking if that's the way it worked, would that be the right way to do things? Is that what
I'm
you're
not
asking?
asking if that's the right way to do. I still think no matter what the convention proposes, it still has to come back to the states under our United States Constitution right now that says 3/4 of the states have to ratify. I don't think a convention could self-ratify. I think maybe I misunderstood your testimony there, but I get back to the ratification side, and that's what provides me some comfort in knowing that even if we have subject matters that are taken up in a convention that are not what it was called for, those matters still need to be ratified by 3/4 of the states.
Well, the fact is that the delegates to the convention of 1787 were under the Articles of Confederation. They were to meet under the Articles of Confederation. Article 13 of the Articles is where the requirement for unanimous ratification of any amendments was located. And so Article 13, in order for that to change, it required an amendment to change that. It was not within the purview, within the orders of the delegates to make an amendment within the convention, excuse me. It was not in their orders, neither from Congress nor from the states to do that. They were to propose amendments. And yet they chose to effectively amend the articles within the convention and without going outside to the states. And the previous testimony stating that this package was eventually ratified. Well, of course it was eventually ratified by all 13 states, but the package said that only 9 states were necessary. And certainly Rhode Island did not approve of that change. Rhode Island did not even send delegates to the convention. They protested the whole idea of the convention to such a great extent that they refused to participate. And they absolutely would not have considered any change like that to be appropriate because it further disenfranchised Rhode Island specifically. So does that answer your question? I don't think it does, but I think we're trying to get at the same point anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we might just have to agree to disagree on this one.
And Madison did, after all, say they're free to do anything they want with the Constitution by invoking the power of we the people.
Thank you. Committee, further questions? Representative Humphreys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just start this comment by saying I haven't done near the study. I'm only 7 years into even understanding the Convention of States, so I'm not an authority, but just as somewhat of a newcomer, it strikes me that your testimony, a good piece of it is saying those delegates that were at that convention were bad actors. And you say you respect the founders, but a lot of this is just about how they were bad actors. And so what I don't understand is we've had bad actors before. The Supreme Court has made egregious decisions, and we don't just say horrible decisions, bad actors, so we give up. I don't understand how Article 5 is in the Constitution. Are those just empty words? Do they not mean for something to happen? I don't know that there's a deep question there, but what I'm saying is, okay, I might disagree that they were bad actors because I think the Constitution is a great document, and that's what we ended up with in 1787. But I don't understand how it happened bad once, so we just give up. So then Article 5 is just empty words. And I don't know if there's a question there, but I'm sure the chairman would give you a couple minutes to respond to that. But that's where I'm coming from as someone who is just looking at this, trying to understand. Thank you.
Chairman, may I? Yes. With all due respect, Representative Humphreys, I feel that you're trying to put words in my mouth, and very, very disrespectfully, because I state very clearly that and this is from my testimony, directly from my testimony, I put it in parentheses, but I have great respect for the founders and the U.S. Constitution they created. And this information is presented to firmly substantiate that the delegates acted beyond the authority granted in their charters. That's what I stated. I don't consider them to be bad actors. And one of the most fundamental components of the Constitution is the First Amendment. It's the First Amendment. And one of the most fundamental components of a free society is the right and the obligation to question what went on in history. Do I consider them bad actors? No, they were two groups of people, one saying we should proceed, one saying we should stop. I have a great deal of respect for both sides. And one of the most interesting things is that Colonel George Mason, even himself, began, and I give this quote from George Mason, he began by saying we should proceed. But by the end of the convention, he was so dismayed by the contents of the Constitution, he said, and this is a paraphrase because it comes from Madison's notes about the Constitution. George Mason himself said, as the convention was coming to its end and the Constitution was coming to its fullness, he said, I would rather have my right arm cut off than have it be applied to this document. And that is a paraphrase because it's a paraphrase of a paraphrase, but it's essentially what he said. I'd rather have my right arm cut off than have it be applied to this document, used to sign this document. He switched his opinion about what was supposed to happen during the process of the convention. If George Mason can argue with himself, I certainly can find disagreements. I'm certainly legitimate in finding questions that I would ask of both sides. That's one of the fundamental things of a free society, is the right to question what has gone before. And certainly you'd want us to question things like slavery and the fact that women didn't vote and those other issues that were present at that time. Certainly you'd want us to question those things. Were they bad actors? No, they progressed our system of government with such great strides that I have deep respect for what they accomplished.
Thank you.
Were they perfect? No.
Mr. Chairman.
John, thank you. Thank you.
I did reference that you did say that you had great respect for him, but then as I read on, that's what made me kind of
And I want to warn the conferee not to disrespect this committee.
I
Okay.
I apologize.
Mr. Chairman.
I did feel disrespected though.
Well,
and I felt
I'm just
put on the
telling you to
spot.
stop right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, further questions? Representative Saunders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're of the belief that if the convention passed, if there was a convention of states and it passed out a proposed amendment or two or whatever, that there's a real legitimate possibility that it wouldn't have to go through the ratification process that every other amendment has gone through. You think that's a real possibility?
Well, I'll just quote Madison again.
I don't want you to quote Madison. I'm asking your opinion.
Well, that's exactly what Madison believes, and I believe it too.
Okay.
I believe that the convention process allows the delegates to invoke those fundamental rights and the full authority, the full sovereign authority of we the people in the convention process. And I give extensive legal evidence of that, including cases from state constitutions, which are not in the same jurisdiction, and I honor that, but they should not be claimed to be under Article 5 when the proponents argue about state constitutions either. But I give evidence of state constitutions that are runaway, constitutional conventions that are runaway. And those state constitutional conventions, when they are runaway, in those you'll find that the delegates invoke the same supreme sovereign authority of we the people. And they have stated that that is the highest legislative authority in the land is we, the people.
All right, so that's a long way of saying yes.
It is, and
Okay.
that's my
All
answer
right,
is
well,
yes.
thank you, sir. Appreciate
Thank
you
you.
being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for you. So what, you're railing against the Convention of States. Let's hear your plan.
Yes, the plan is to enforce the Constitution. That's correct. And it's to build grassroots movements that do exactly that. I would wish that this
So how's
convention.
that working out for us?
Well, that's a good question. Last week, a small team from our Campaign for Liberty team stopped HB 2211 in the Kansas committee. We were told that we were the reason that it was tabled. HB 2211, by the way, would have put the power of the Kansas Guard under the Department of Homeland Security.
So we're talking federal here. So
Pardon?
We're talking federal issues here?
Yes, and
Okay.
And we're talking a federal issue here because the Department of Homeland Security is a federal agency. And we stopped that usurpation of Kansas National Guard authority or might by the Federal Department of Homeland Security. We helped co-author the Kansas Legal Tender Act, which has been introduced here last week. We co-authored it about 4 or 5 years ago. And the Kansas Legal Tender Act would make gold and silver legal tender here in the state of Kansas.
And how do you think that's going to work out?
But I hope it would pass.
Okay.
And if it passes, when it passes, it will be the first step towards sound money banking here in the state. Sound money banking, if it were to occur in every state, it would fully displace the fiat currency that we have today. When we displace the fiat currency, you don't have the opportunity for debt. Fiat currency can be created out of thin air. Gold and silver money cannot.
Okay.
If we had gold and silver based money, which is the only constitutional money under Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, if we had that, the debt that we have today would be impossible.
Okay. We have a $31 trillion national debt, $87,000 owed for each citizen of the United States, 1.1 million owed for every taxpayer. What I'm concerned about is your plan, this plan, we're not even going to have a country to worry about. All we're going to have left is the Constitution, and the rest of our country is going to be gone. So I get it. Gold and silver sounds like a good thing. That could take years. We don't have years to address this issue.
May I respond?
You may.
Okay. And first of all, I want to say that my comments earlier were merely intended to express my feelings about what was being said, not to express disrespect to anybody. But to answer your question directly, if we take on the wrong measure or the wrong approach to trying to solve the problems, we won't get there. And what we will do in taking on the wrong approach is we will simply delay the implementation of the right approach. And what's happening right now is that extensive resources at the grassroots level are being wasted by this dispute between Convention of States or enforce the Constitution. And like I've said, our group is doing quite a bit to enforce the Constitution. Even at the state level, it can be enforced. And this is the right thing to be doing. And you're correct. We are on a steep downward slide. There's no question about that. And we have very little time. And I absolutely agree. And that's why I believe firmly that we should all side on the side of enforcing the Constitution. And because when you enforce the Constitution, you properly attack these problems at the roots. You don't come up with solutions that actually worsen the problem. You attack the problems at their roots and really solve them.
All right, very good. Thank you. I have one more question, and then we're going to shut down the debate unless there's something just absolutely. Representative Epley.
I just got to make a comment, John, and I appreciate your passion, and I've gotten to hear you testify before, but you know, you'd like to quote Madison, who was a fantastic patriot. He was a great patriot to our country. But if he had to experience, segueing off my chairman, what he said, $31.7 trillion deficit, which is the end of our country in the near future, and career politicians that we've all been subjected to in the last 50 years, I think that Mr. Madison would sew his right arm back on, use his left arm and both feet to sign this convention of the states. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good.
Right,
Thank you
yeah.
very much for your testimony.
May I comment real quick?
Very quickly.
Yep. Well, it was Mr. Mason that made the statement about it cutting off his right arm. But if we had had the balanced budget amendment 21, 22 years ago, if we had had that, any balanced budget amendment would certainly have exception clauses, war, a national emergency. But what have we had during the last 22 years? We've had war. We've had a national emergency for the last several years. Those exception clauses could have easily been invoked if we had a balanced budget amendment, and we'd still be in the same spot that we're in today. Absolutely the same place we're in today. Why? Because fiat currency is cheap currency. It likes to be spent. But sound money places a fiscal restraint of its own on the legislature.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for being here, John. I bring the committee's attention. There are three written opponents: Blake Branson, Daniel Chase, and Robert Wood. So, committee, I might bring to your attention, we will work this bill next Tuesday. And there was inadvertently a small paragraph left out of the bill that was introduced. We'll work that as an amendment and add it back in. It was some inadvertent mistake that left that amendment out. So with that, let me make sure that I have everything done here except how to address Representative Thomas by the correct name. And I'll try to get that right. So we're adjourned.
Smith.
And there you have it, folks. We just brought you a special edition of COS Live where we showed you the live stream of the Kansas House Committee that is right now considering our Article 5 Convention of the States application. And that committee hearing has now wrapped up and drawn to a close. And they mentioned that they would be working the bill next Tuesday. So I expect that's when we'll get a vote. And stay tuned. We will keep you posted on how that turns out. Thanks for joining us.